Hey guys, do you want to know how to make a goal tracker using DataStores just like this? So as you click the button, as you can see, your progress goes towards your goal. I'm going to show you how to keep track of that goal, as well as having that data save for when you leave and when you join back. Alright guys, let's get right into this tutorial. So before I start the tutorial, I just want to say, well, thank you guys for your patience. I've been gone for like about a month because I just finished school and finals, and after that I was kind of just chilling, working on the game a bit, so I've been pretty busy. Well, without further ado, let's just get right into the tutorial. So first thing we're going to do is just set everything up before we get into the scripting and the data stores and the fun stuff. So the first thing that we're actually going to do is just go into our server script service, and I'm just going to add a server script called main. So what this script is going to do, it's going to act as kind of the holder for the modules. So the main module scripts we're going to be using are a data store one, which by the way we're going to be scripting. So I'll be explaining all of this as we move on. And one that's going to hold all the information in our table for new players. And we'll just name this one data profile. Alright, so since we're going to be communicating not only just on the server but the client as well, we're going to want a remote event. So we're going to add that remote event right now, and we're just going to name that remote event game events. So all this is going to do is going to make it so, for example, when the player clicks a button, it sends an event to the server saying, add this amount of gold to the player's balance, and that's all it's going to do pretty much. And then maybe we'll do some stuff on the server and fire the client. And finally, we're going to just add a bit of UI. So I'm going to go to the starter GUI, add a screen GUI, and we'll add a local script in here. This local script is going to handle all of the client's, information, such as the gold amount. It's going to kind of scale the progress bar, stuff like that. So I'll just name this main. Also, we'll also make that capital just to keep it consistent. We'll also want to add the main UI that I had earlier in the intro. So I'm going to add a frame. That's going to be the background. So how these XP, how these gold bars work, is it has one background that is the entire size, and then when you add a bar in the middle and you do offset size, for example, let me just change this background color to something else so you could see the difference. If you have this frame, let me rename this to progress, this one to background. So, okay, here's the progress bar. This progress bar, its size will be in respect to its parent. So, for example, halfway is just 0.5 in the x-axis. Fully is 1 in the x-axis. And we could take advantage of we can take advantage of that later on to have proper scaling in our UI. So I'll also go into further detail on that now. So I'm just going to kind of change the color a bit because we like our UI to look nice here and clean, although I'm not like an insane UI designer, so I'll get it as close to clean as I can. I'll add a UI corner. All that's going to do is add a little corner effect to it. All of these guys are just aesthetic. If you don't want to do this, or if you want to make your own design, go ahead. I'm just going to recolor a bit so it looks kind of like a gold bar. Make this a yellowish. I'm going to add a UI gradient. A UI gradient will just make it so it kind of fades from one color to the other. We'll have it start off orangish and end off yellow. I will also add a UI corner to this. So that's what our XP bar is going to look like. Sorry, our gold bar. I'm using gold for this. I don't know why. It doesn't matter. You could use it for XP if you want. So that's the bar. That's all we need for that. And one more thing we need is a text button. This text button is just going to allow us to add gold. It's going to be the main messenger between the server and the client. So I'm just going to name this gold. I'm going to turn text scaled on, and I'm going to just change the color of the background. Make it golden, why not? And then we'll put a UI corner in here as well. We'll have this as our button for now. That's fine. Mount. Actually, there's one more thing I do want to add. I'm just going to have a text label that actually keeps track of the gold amount in here. I'm going to set the background transparency to 1, turn text scaled on, and oops, we're just going to have this labeled 0, 0 for now. Alright, now we can actually get into the scripting. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go into our main script here. So this is going to be a very minimal script. It's literally going to be like one line. It's not going to be much. I just like to have the server scripts organized and kind of modularized into multiple scripts. That's my like scripting style. That's how I prefer it to be. It's much more readable that way. So all we're going to do is require the DataStores script, and that will just allow all of the information and code in this script to run. So once we do that, we're going to get right into scripting the data store. So if you aren't familiar with data stores, basically how they work is that you have a player and you have their information. You just store the player's information and like a table into a store, and whenever the player joins back, you can retrieve their information, so there's no data loss. So we're just going to create a few variables here. Player's data, and to actually get the data store service, we're going to call we're just going to get that service. We need this to use the service. And then we're going to get a data store, and we're going to name this, I'm going to name this tutorial 1. You can name this whatever you want. So basically what this line is doing is just getting the data store service, and then it's going to get a data store from that service. And if you like change this name from 1 to 2, for example, like tutorial 1, tutorial 2, these are completely different data stores. So make sure you have all the players' information in one data store. So, or you can have multiple, but you want it to be organized. So have your data stores named appropriately, please. We're going to get a few more variables. We're going to get the player service. We want to keep track of the players when they join and when they leave. Joining and leaving. We're going to get replicated storage. Remember, replicated storage will allow us to communicate or grab objects on both the server and the client. The client does not have access to the server script service. They don't have access to the server storage. So we're going to use a replicated storage. Just like that. And there's actually one more we're going to be getting, and that's run service. We're only going to be using this for one thing in particular. Ooh, not that. And that's going to be is studio. We're going to use this to check basically, is studio. If the player is on studio, you'll see here in a second. I don't want to go into too much depth on this variable yet because I really only use it one time. So you'll see all that in a second. And now I'm just going to grab this event from replicated storage. So game events equals replicated storage, wait for child, and then game events. Again, communication between the client and server. This is crucial. We need this event or we cannot have anything. I mean, we can, but we want things to be changed in the client appropriately. And then finally, we have the data profile, which I actually haven't even showed you guys what it does yet. So once I get that, I will indeed go into the data profile. I will show you what it does. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on the data profile, open up that module script. So there's not much to this module either. So what we're going to do, we're just going to name this data profile. It doesn't really matter. Okay, and then data profile create. So all this is just a function. We're going to use this to create data in the DataStores script. So data equals empty and then gold equals 0. So you could have as much information as you want. For example, if you want an EXP section, you can have that. If you want to have an inventory section where it keep track of the player's inventory, you can definitely do that too. But for the sake of the tutorial, we're only going to have a gold field. Okay, and once we're done writing out our data, we're just going to return that. So this doesn't actually do anything. This script is just a helper function to create that table. We're putting it in a separate script because if you're creating a game, chances are you're not only going to have a gold data field, you're going to have multiple data fields, and this script could become huge. So we're going to make it so this is just in a separate script for organization purposes. And that's exactly what module scripts are perfect for. Modularizing information, making things readable, making it so our code's not super confusing. I know code can always look confusing, but module scripts help. And now that we have that, we can actually start our function or our actual script. So I'm going to have a local variable as a table, and this is going to hold all of the server's data. We're going to be getting all the players' information and putting it into this server data table in a second. So the user ID will be the key, and if you put the player's key in, it will return their data. Returns the data. And again, you'll see all this in action in a second. Next thing we want to do is detect when a player joins and leaves the game. For now, we're just going to see when they join. So up here, remember we have this, players joining and leaving. Look at this, if we type in players dot player added, they have an event for this. So we're going to connect this to a function, and every time a player joins the game, everything inside of here will run. Okay, so by the way, there's an argument that gets passed through whenever a player joins, and that's just them, their player object. We're going to need that. Okay, so we don't have redundancies within the table. For example, if multiple players have the same name somehow, or there's a glitch, we're going to have the player's user ID. The user ID is unique to the player. This is probably the most efficient way, the best way of storing players' information. So I highly recommend using the player's user ID to store away information. So next thing we want to do is make sure that the player doesn't have any. This is kind of this isn't really needed, but it's good to have. So we're just going to make sure that the player doesn't have any existing data within the server. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to type in local player data equals, and then we're going to call the player's data. We're going to get that variable, and we're going to see if the player has any existing data. So what getAsync does is it will basically call a function from this service, and it will check if the player has any existing data. If the player does not have data, this will return nil. That is very important. If player has no data, this returns nil. So the only argument that this will need is user ID. So if the player doesn't have any data, then this is their first time playing. So you could do whatever in here. This is their first time joining the game. That's how you detect if they have data or not. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to create a data profile for them. So we're going to do player data equals, and then, oops, let me capitalize this. Because remember, this is nil, we're going to change this to an empty table of new information. Data profile create, and this will just, again, return an empty table of just the data. We got one item in here, gold. Alright, and finally, we're going to put the player's information into this server data table. Alright, so we're just going to type in player data. Either they have data or they don't. So either way, this will never be nil. Next thing we want to do is we want to detect if the player is leaving the game. The player removing. So if the player is leaving the game, this function will run. And once again, the player will get passed through as an argument. Since we are using the player's user ID as their key, we're just going to grab that, put in a variable, variable real quick. Player data, and then we're going to set the player's data. There is one caveat with this function, right? So why we only do this when the players are leaving and when Roblox is updating is because if you call this function too many times, it will actually be put into a queue and their data will stop saving. So we're only going to call this when the player is leaving the game. Remember, setAsync is just going to override the previous data they have in the data store with the new data. So I'm going to type in the user ID, and then we're just going to get the server data and the data corresponding to that spot. And then of course we want to set that equal to nil so their data doesn't stick in the server. That's all we need in the player removing. And now is where we use run service. So have you ever thought of like when Roblox updates and all the servers shut down, you get force put out of the game. So to combat that, we're going to do game BindToClose. So this means Roblox is updating or maybe has a problem and the player isn't necessarily leaving. They might just be like, shutting down immediately. So first thing that we want to do is make sure that the player isn't in studio, because if they're in studio, it's most likely just a developer doing their work, and they don't need this. And the thing is, whenever you click the stop button in studio, technically the game's being binded to close, so you'll get like warnings saying that you're sending too much data to the DataStore service. And now what we want to do is just force save everybody's data so they don't lose any progress. So what we're going to do is go through this table, get all the players' data. So for ID, data in pairs, server data. So we're using a for each loop to get everyone's data. Okay, so what we're going to do is wrap this into a pcall. All a pcall is a function that if it fails, it will give you a success value. If it succeeds, it will give you a success value. If it fails, it will give you the assertion, the warning, or why it failed. It will not throw the error. You could basically like exception handle. That's what it is. Exception handling. Okay. So player data setAsync, and then we're just going to set the player's data. And then basically the same thing that we did up here. Alright, and we're going to do if not success, i.e. if it fails. You could do if fail also, it doesn't really matter what you do. Then we're just going to warn and it will print the fail message. That's all it does. Alrighty, so now we can actually start the fun stuff and not the boring data store stuff, but that's why you came here, so it's very important that you know all this. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I am going to use this event to communicate when the player clicks on this button and wants to add gold to their bar. So what we're going to do is go to our main local script. So this script isn't going to be terribly complicated. It's just going to be changing text, stuff like that. So I'm going to create a few variables. Gold amount. That doesn't really make sense as a text button name. We'll rename that to gold button. And we want to rename this text label to gold. Script.parent.gold. And then once again, we're going to get the replicated storage because we want to be able to communicate between the server and the client. Oops. And then since we have replicated storage, we can now get the event. This stuff is very similar to what we did on the server. Don't overthink it. We're just instantiating and declaring some variables so we can use these later on. And since we're also on the client, we have access to the player, like always. This isn't on the server. The client is always just you or whoever's playing. And now we just want to get the background and the progress bar. Oops, there we go. Script.parent. Wait for child, background, local progress. Script.parent, wait for child, progress. Oops, why did I say that? This is actually in the background. Alright, so since this bar will have as like, we'll just say like we want to reach 1,000 golds. That would be like 100 clicks or something. We'll just say our goal is 1,000 gold. This really, this is just a random variable I have just for fun. You'll see what it does in a second. This will keep track of the current goal the player has. This, by the way, does not have any impact on the server. All the player's data should be done on the server. Exploiters can easily change data on the client if they really wanted to. All the important stuff should be done on the server. That is crucial for any game. Alright, so what we're going to do is say game events. The on client event connect function. So whenever the server fires this event to the client, we're going to have it do something. So we're going to have a few parameters pass through. One's just going to be the request and one will be the argument. For example, if the request is to add gold, that is exactly what we'll do. We'll just add gold. We'll say else if the request is to load data, we'll load the player's data. Of course, the data that will be loaded is just stuff the player sees, such as the current amount of gold they have. So now what we want to do is get whenever the player clicks on this button, and we're going to add gold. So game events, we'll do button, mouse button 1 down, connect function. So whenever the player clicks on the button, we're going to fire the server. So we're going to communicate between the client and the server. So the only arguments we're going to have here, we're going to have add gold because that's going to be our request to the server. And we're going to have an amount. We want to add 10 gold to the player's data. So now what we're going to do, navigate back to the DataStores script and go to the bottom. All we have to do is do game events on server event connect that to a function. Again, we got a request and an argument. If the request is to add gold, we will add gold. So we'll have a local function here to do that for us, just to keep the main event organized. Okay, so what we want to do is, we actually need a player here. Player should be the first argument that's passed through from the server. Okay, so we want the player and we want the amount. Alright, so once we got that down, then we could just get the player's data. So local user ID equals player.userid. And remember, to get the player's data, we have this table. And like I said, user ID will be the key. So by having the user ID, we can just get the player's data. So local data equals server data user ID. Okay, so now we have the data. And the data kind of looks like this. It's just one field, and that might be named gold. So what we're going to do is say data.gold plus or equals amount, since we're adding that amount. This is the same as writing data.gold plus amount. We're just kind of limiting the redundancies within our code. Data.gold plus or equals amount. That's all we're doing. Alright, so once we do that, then we could actually, let me see. Yeah, we'll do this all in the same line, just because it will look super clean that way. It doesn't matter if you want to split it up or not. It might be easier to read this way. There we go. So that will add gold to the player's inventory. All we have to do is call that player, comma, argument. So this will add gold. Oops. This will add gold to the player's data store. This doesn't do anything visual quite yet. We're gonna actually script it a bit so it does something visual. So what we're gonna do is game events fire client player, comma, and then what we're gonna have is just the amount of gold that was added. I guess that could just be the amount. We'll just put that back into the client. So what this is doing, it's just going to take the event and it's going to fire to the client. So now where this is going to go, it's going to go to this event that we created earlier, game events.onClient event. So we actually need this to be gold. Because remember, the second argument is the request. And if the request is equal to gold, that's what it's going to do. It's going to add gold. So then we could actually go into our client and we could start scripting this. It's going to be a very similar method to what we did on the server, except it's just going to change the text labels. So what we're going to do is take the current gold plus or equal the amount. We'll take the gold amount. And remember, this is just actually, this is just the gold.text. This is just a text label that we have just to keep track of the amount of gold. We're going to concatenate that with a string, and then we'll have that as goal. And I'm not going to go into too much depth just for purpose of length of like how I scale this. You guys can do some research if you want to like know how I'm like scaling this. I'll briefly explain it, but I won't go into too much detail. So basically what I'm going to do is get the current gold, divide that by the goal amount. This is going to give me a percentage between 0 and 1. Or sorry, not percentage, a decimal. It acts as a percentage. You could think of 0.5 as halfway in between. So for example, if we have 500 gold divided by 1000 is 0.5. 100 gold divided by 200 gold is just going to be 0.5. If we have 100 gold 100 divided by 100 is 1. So that's the full width of the frame. That's what we're going to use. That's going to be the x offset. So progress.size, and since we're editing a frame, it uses udim2s, comma 1. Actually, we'll have this 0.7. And remember, this is offset, so this is just like how big it is in relation to the frame it's parented to. Okay, so that's all we needed to add the gold. And there's actually one more function I do want to add before the end of this video. We're almost there, guys. I know this is like a mouthful, but if you get confused, feel free to just replay the clip, do whatever. We'll add the amount, and that's just going to be the argument. And we're going to create one more function, and that's going to be loading the player's data. Since we want to actually, like, when the player joins, we want to see the data when they first join, we're just going to have the server tell the client when the player joins. That's all we're going to do. And we're going to do something very similar to the add gold. Load data, and we're just going to take the player's data directly. So we're going to say current gold equals data.gold. And just remember, the data profile looks like this. Data.gold equals how much they have. And then we'll say gold amount.text equals current gold dot goal. Again, very similar to up here. And then we'll just copy and paste this. And my bad, I mistyped this again. Same problem. So just change this to gold.text. So let me just put this here, load data argument. So I want to go back to the data store. If request equals add gold, then it will add gold. And we want to make it so when the player joins, that that event gets fired. So let me quickly do that. We'll have a function here, load data on client, and this will have the player as an argument, and all this will do is just do game events, fire client, player, loaded data, and then again, this is the request. That's what we're telling the client to do, and we're going to do server data player.userid. So what I'm going to do is come down here, load data on client, player.userid. Okay, that was a lot. And now I'm going to test to see if it works. I'd be very surprised if this plays with no errors. Now that I think of it, we're going to enable API access to the servers. Watch if I even do anything. Yeah. Before we actually do this, I need to everyone go to their game settings, and we actually need to publish our game to Roblox. We'll name this DataStore Tutorial 1. You guys can name this whatever you want. I'm going to publish this, and now we can go to game settings, permissions, actually go to security, and then enable studio access to API services. This will give us access to the data store service. Surprisingly, it didn't tell us in the client. That kind of gives me an idea of that there might be a problem. Okay, so yeah, nothing's happening right now. So I'm just gonna check and figure out what the problem might be. Oh, that's because I'm doing script.data profile. Let me change that to script.datastore. That should do something. It should at least throw an error for us to troubleshoot. First error we get is attempt to index number with user ID. So that is just because I passed through the player's user ID in this function. Just change that real quick. We'll try one more time, see what happens. Error number 2, let's see what we got here. Attempt to index nil with gold. And this looks to be on the client. Okay, another dumb error by me. I didn't even notice I did this. I made this player's data. This should just be player data. This is why you should make things significantly different from each other. I couldn't even tell. So yeah, I'm going to name that to player data, and we'll see. Again, I changed a ton, so I'm not surprised that there's quite a few errors in the code. Attempt to index nil with gold. Same problem still, though. Alright guys, I think I found the main root to the problem. Over here, I had if player data. I'm not sure why I said if player data. You want to try if not player data. Okay, put in a big not there and then play the game and let's see what happens. I already tested, so I have some progress. Like every time I click, we get closer to our goal. When I stop, it should save my data. When I play again, my data should be there still. There we go, we got our data. So guys, that's pretty much the tutorial. I thank you for sticking around. I know that was like a ton in one tutorial, but I kind of like to have more meaningful tutorials. I highly recommend using this type of data saving method because it will save you in the future. Like if you're grabbing your data from a value, like an integer value, before the player leaves, that's going to cause a lot of problems, a lot of data loss. Okay, so I recommend using this method. If not, that's perfectly fine. If you guys enjoyed this video and would like to see more content in the future, you can definitely leave a like, or if you have feedback, also feel free to leave any feedback in the comments. Other than that, guys, thanks for watching and have a great day.